Now let me then turn to Gandhi, and I will present a talk which I call Gandhi for Today. The central topic here, as I said in this session, is Gandhi. And Gandhi's work, of course, is enormous, it's sprawling, it comprises some 100 volumes and deals with many, many different topics and many different subjects. However, I want to focus on one area of his life and of his work, which I believe is central and tends to overshadow the rest. That is the area of politics and political action. So, in my talk, Gandhi for Today, I emphasize on the implications of Gandhi's work, because it's not enough simply to know about Gandhi as a historical figure. The task is for us to follow Gandhi, to enact his teaching in our life. So, Gandhi for today, for us. How can we live Gandhi's teachings? My subtitle is called Self-Rule, Non-Violence, and Struggle for Justice. The Indian terms, the Sanskrit terms, and the Hindi terms for these three concepts are Swaraj, Ahimsa, and Satyagraha. Now, Swaraj tells us what is democratic government. Ahimsa tells us how to achieve and practice this kind of government. And Satyagraha tells us about the goal of government, of politics and political life. The goal which is pursuit of truth, pursuit of justice, or the good life. Now, these are the ideas which we have to relearn, because to a very large extent we have unlearned them. We certainly do not practice them. Now, Gandhi struggled for India's self-rule, or what he also called home rule, against the mighty British Empire, where the sun did not set, as they say. Today, many people are struggling for self-rule, again against the mighty world empire, against or many other forms of domination, a world empire, again, where the sun does not set. Now, Gandhi struggled for Indian self-rule, but mainly non-violently. Today, many movements aiming at freedom, at independence and self-government resort to violence, virtually as the only or the preferred method of action. Gandhi struggled for self-rule with an aim, a distinct aim to establish rule of justice, non-domination, and ethical rightness. This is what he called Satyagraha. Today, many movements seek self-rule only in order to establish a new form of domination, a new form of exploitation, namely their own domination. They want to throw out some people who are ruling in order to put themselves into the rule of government. So we have to relearn a whole lot about Gandhi and from Gandhi. Now let me say some words about self-rule, Swaraj. And then I turn to Ahimsa and Satyagraha. As we know, it was over 100 years ago in 1909 that Mohandas Gandhi penned a famous book which is called Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule. A text which is justly famous because it has stood the test of time. The book was Gandhi's opening salvo in his attack on colonialism and imperialism, and his first public plea for Indian independence, freedom, liberation from foreign domination. What is urgent and imperative today is an effort to recover the guiding spirit of this text, of Gandhi's text of Hind Swaraj, the message pervading its pages, and especially the meaning of Swaraj, of self-rule. In my view, the significance of Swaraj can be found on two levels. One which is more overt or directly accessible, and the other which is more recessed and more of long delay or of long duration. The first level has to do with Indian struggle for self-government, for independence, and subsequent struggles more or less directly inspired by Gandhi's example. It is this level which tends to capture immediate political attention. In a sense, Gandhi's Hind Swaraj can be seen as a classic of anti-imperialist literature, a handbook of the struggle not only for Indians, but for oppressed and colonized people all around the world. The handbook has galvanized people in many continents and has ultimately led to the demise of the traditional European empires. It has also become a textbook in America for African Americans involved in the civil rights struggle led by Martin Luther King Jr. It served as an inspiration for the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, as well as for several so-called Velvet Revolution in Eastern Europe and against Soviet imperialism. As one needs to add right away, this level of significance is by no means exhausted today. In the words of the great Palestinian-American writer Edward Said, imperialism or imperial ambitions have by no means come to an end, but only resurface in new guises or constellations. What mainly characterizes such ambitions, according to Edward Said, today, in comparison with earlier empires, is what he calls the quantitative leap in the reach of cultural authority and the unprecedented growth in the apparatus of the diffusion and control of information in the media. Now, the other level of Swaraj is more recessed and shielded from view, mainly because of its ethical and more philosophical implications. In my view, Gandhi's Hind Swaraj captures the basic meaning of democracy and democratic freedom, a meaning which is not restricted to subjugated or colonized people, but to friends of democracy everywhere. Basically, his text formulates a conception of self-rule, of self and of self-rule Swaraj, which is required for genuine democracy, in my view, in contradistinction from other forms of government like monarchy, aristocracy, or theocracy. The conception also differs very sharply from prevalent equations of democracy, which individual or collective self-interest, self-seeking, and the unhampered pursuit of self-interest. What surfaces behind this contrast is a different or starkly revised understanding of democratic freedom, or what it means to be free. And that is what in Swaraj is the most prominent and the most fertile and the most inspiring aspect of Swaraj, that it gives a new meaning of what it means to be free. Following a discussion of prevalent conditions in India, Gandhi's Hind Swaraj turns immediately to the issue of self-rule, finding it mired in confusion. In the opinion of many people, self-rule consists simply of throwing the British out of India. What is more simple than that? But Gandhi says it does not seem that many people have properly considered and thought about this. For Gandhi, the goal of Swaraj could not be obtained by simply replacing British rule with Indian rule, British power with Indian power. The problem is much deeper and much more complex for Gandhi, involving a change in the very meaning and character of rule. Those people, whether to a simple expulsion of the British, he noted, seem to want, he says, the English rule without the Englishman, the tiger's nature but not the tiger. Successful pursuit of this policy, he says, would make India English. And when it becomes English, it will be called not Hindustan, but Anglistan. This is not the Swaraj I want, Gandhi says. So for Gandhi, the problem with British democracy, or much of Western democracy, is the primacy of self-indulgence and self-interest at the cost of ethical or spiritual commitments. Gandhi is not unaware that Western modernity has also brought greater freedom for many people, including political freedom for blacks or women. This freedom, however, is very often tarnished by misuse, he says. In his words, the gist of modern civilization lies in the fact, and I quote him, that people living in that Western civilization make bodily or material welfare the sole object of life. What is lacking in this civilization, according to Gandhi, is ethical responsibility, responsiveness, and unselfish striving involving ethical self-transformation. In the text of, in the language of Hind Swaraj, and I quote Gandhi, "The Western civilization takes note of neither morality nor religion. Morality, niti, nor religion, dharma. It seeks to increase material comforts and fails miserably even in doing so," end of quote. In a section titled, "How Can India Become Free?" How can India become free? Gandhi proceeds to offer a concise definition of the term Swaraj, or self-rule, as he sees it. He says, "It is Swaraj when we learn to rule ourselves." When we learn to master ourselves, this is real Swaraj. Swaraj as self-rule, as rule over oneself, is surely the opposite of selfish rule, or rule by a selfish elite, in the sense of tyranny, aristocracy, autocracy, or domination. To this extent, it points to the core meaning of democracy. In my own interpretation, public Swaraj means self-government or genuine democracy, but democracy in turn needs people, needs a certain kind of people, namely people who are able to rule themselves. That is, people who are not captive to selfish addiction, to the lust for power, the greed for wealth, the impulse of destruction, or any other forms of violence. As one can see, we are here on a very steep incline. Swaraj, as Gandhi sees it, means basically an ethical ascent, an ethical self-transformation, a willingness to shed all forms of himsa or violence in favor of nonviolence, or ahimsa, where the latter denotes not just absence from overt violence, but a commitment to honoring the goodness or the good life in all its dimensions. As Gandhi wrote in 1916 in another text, in its negative form, ahimsa means not injuring any living being, either bodily or in mind. In its positive form, nonviolence means the largest love, the greatest charity for all. So this is meaning of nonviolence, the greatest charity for all. Now, the role of to pursue and obtain Swaraj for Gandhi is the reliance on what he called satyagraha, or truth-doing, and nonviolence, and he calls these the most important moral or ethical norms, norms which are not obtained, which are not cloistered virtues or segregated virtues, but discovered only through actual living in ordinary life, in day-to-day living. Once these norms are widely cultivated and taken to heart, a different type of democracy emerges or comes into view, one in which freedom and ethical interdependence are closely linked under the heading of Swaraj, of self-rule. Now, just a few additional comments on ahimsa and satyagraha. As is well known, the idea of civil resistance first preoccupied Gandhi during his struggle against apartheid in South Africa, a struggle which later changed into a struggle for independence in India. Now, despite the vastly changed territory, the spirit or guiding animus of the struggle remained always the same for Gandhi: the pursuit of justice, the pursuit of social, political improvement, equity, and good life. When initiating the resistance movement in South Africa, Gandhi tellingly gave this movement the name of Satyagraha, a term which literally translated means truth-doing. So it's also translated as a soul force or love force, but basically it means justice-seeking. Truth-seeking, justice-seeking, that's the goal of politics. The goal is the seeking for the good life. Now, there can be little doubt that for Gandhi, the guiding principle of political struggle was always nonviolent action, ahimsa. That is, in his view, satyagraha and ahimsa are intimately linked. As he stated in one of his writings on the topic, in the application of satyagraha, the searching for justice, I discovered in the earliest stages that pursuit of truth does not admit of violence being inflicted on one's opponent, but that it must be weaned free from error by patience, and sympathy. End of quote. The main point here is that for Gandhi, it is better to suffer injustice than to impose injustice on others. That's a very cardinal, very central principle for Gandhi. As the psychologist Erik Erikson has written, Gandhian truth performance, or satyagraha, is governed by the readiness to get hurt, yet not to hurt. The readiness to get hurt oneself, but not to impose hurt on others. If there was a guiding dogma in his approach, it was this principle, that the only test of truth or justice is action based on the refusal to do harm, to inflict harm. That's a basic Gandhian doctrine or principle. Now, Gandhi's enactment of this maxim was evident throughout his life in his willingness to accept suffering in the form, as we know, of fasting, imprisonment, abuse, ultimately assassination, death. A willingness guided by the desire to appeal to the conscience and better ethical qualities of his opponents. Now, despite these and similar statements in Gandhi's writings, some interpreters have raised questions about the role of nonviolence or ahimsa. Questions which, in my view, mistakenly seem to place on an equal footing violence and nonviolence, justice and injustice. Now, admittedly, Gandhi was not an absolutist. He was not an absolutist in this field of nonviolence. And he made some room for departures from nonviolence. However, these departures were narrowly circumscribed and basically limited by acts of self-defense against an imminent violent attack. So self-defense against imminent violent attacks, that was the only justification for violence, for himsa in Gandhi's teaching. So acts performed and they have to be performed as a last resort and with due regard for proportionality. So in other words, the violence has to be proportional to the violence that is being inflicted. Now, performed outside of these limits, acts of violence for Gandhi were totally illegitimate because they negate the very spirit and goal of satyagraha, of truth-doing or justice-seeking. As Gandhi persistently insisted, the means of struggle have to be in accord with the goal of the struggle. That is, the relation is not purely instrumental but ethical, and the goal is justice. So the pursuit of justice can only be a just pursuit. So the means have to be just if the goal is to be justice. This is the gist of the well-known statement of Gandhi when he wrote, "The means may be likened to a seed, to a small seed. The end is the tree. And there's just the same inviolable connection between the means and the ends as there is between the seed and the tree. We reap exactly as we sow." We reap exactly as we sow. So if we plant violence, we can only expect to reap violence in response. So now, in recent times, the connection which Gandhi always emphasized between means and ends has come widely neglected, sidelined, obscured, or entirely thrown away, with predictable results. Totally neglecting Gandhi's and also Tolstoy's teachings, some recent so-called rebellions or uprisings have preferred to indulge in orgies of violence, unspeakable acts of barbarism, always equally employing bloodshed not as a last resort, but as the first resort. So this is what we experience today with ISIL and others. Unspeakable acts of barbarism, equally employing bloodshed, not as a last resort, but always as a first resort. But the consequences cannot be in doubt. In the words of the political philosopher Hannah Arendt, she wrote memorably, "Violent acts do indeed change the world, namely into a more violent world. Here we are back to the culture of violence. What Gandhi, in my view, admonishes us, exhorts us to do, is to move from this culture, a very prevalent culture of violence, away in a totally different direction, the different direction of what he calls a culture of nonviolence, by practicing these principles which Gandhi has outlined in his work and in his actions and in his politics, these basic ideas which I have formulated as Swaraj, Ahimsa, Satyagraha, self-rule, nonviolence, and truth-seeking or justice-seeking. Thank you very much. Thank you.